Welcome, everyone. It's glad to see that folks are joining us from all over the country. I recognize some names here from all the way from the East Coast of Canada to California. Just give everyone a minute to get signed in as we get started. Again, I'm going to welcome Kevin Lampe of Kurth Lampe and Greg Dunn of the same, who are going to be sharing with us today on how to identify issues and decrease the likelihood they snowball into a crisis. A few little points of information as we get started. There is a time or date change. Actually, it's not a time, it's a date change to webinar number 6 in this 7-part series. So I think we're months ahead of that, but I want that on your radar because we did change the date on it. Number 6, integrating communication and operations, was originally scheduled for April 16, but what I want you to focus on is April 9. April 9 at the same time, 11 a.m. Eastern time, there was that change to the schedule. There was a conflict there, so we updated it to April 9. Also want to let you know that we will have a survey that you will be asked to complete at the end of the webinar. Super short survey, 1 to 2 minutes max. Probably some overachievers on the call will be able to get that done even faster. But we really appreciate getting that kind of feedback, knowing how we're doing, how we're meeting your needs, where there's some opportunities to fill in some additional. So I think that's really important for us to mention and do, and I really do ask you to take it and give us that feedback. So now I really want to turn it over to the team from Kurth Lampe. They are a communication team out of the Chicago area, specializing in strategic communications and issues and crisis management, as well as public affairs. They work around the world. They've had some experience working with the Seventh-day Adventist Church organizations in different types of organizations and around different parts of the world. So I'm going to turn it over to Kevin. Maybe you can take it from here and lead us through our presentation today. Look forward to what you have to share with us. Thank you.
Thank you, David. It's great to be with everybody. Good to have returned those who are with us for the first seminar. Welcome back, and those who are joining us for the first time, we are thrilled to have you, and hopefully we can share some information with you over the next hour, and you can also let us know your questions as we will be doing throughout this. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Greg Dunn, who's going to walk us through our agenda for today.
I would like to echo Kevin's greetings and thanks for participating today. We're very thrilled actually to be collaborating with Adventist Risk Management to walk through a 7-webinar series on this critically important topic for all of you who are very concerned about risk management, and our focus from a communication standpoint on how we can help you learn some of the principles of reputation and issues management and crisis management. So today is another step in that process. Following this overview of what we're going to be talking about today, Kevin and I will share a little bit more about our respective backgrounds and who we are. So we'll get to that next. For those of you who were able to join us 2 weeks ago, we talked about reputation. So this is a very important concept. In my background in corporate public relations, we talk a lot about corporate reputation as a sort of bedrock principle, and we'll talk a little bit more about that today and how it links up to effective issues management. We're going to talk about how to identify topics that could become an issue, but to identify those topics before they become an issue. And then the next step, how do we prepare and manage those issues effectively so that they don't blow up into crises and that we're able to perhaps short circuit any potential damage that might occur down the line. So we have an upcoming webinar session later in February where we really get into this topic in a much greater depth, the difference between an issue and a crisis, but we do address it here because it's sort of foundational to what we're here to talk about today. So we'll share some general principles of effective issues management, and then we'll talk about how, when you reach a point where you sort of feel you have your arms around, say the bushel basket of potential issues, how do you make some strategic decisions, and how do you prioritize, and sort of how do you rate the possible damage of issue 1 versus issue 2 versus issue 3, and how that can factor into your preparation. And then, because this is not a static process, it's really vital to keep an eye on what's happening out in the environment, not only with your own organization, but looking at what's happening to other faith-based organizations, other nonprofits, just some things that you might be seeing in the news that, sort of hit you in the back of your mind and say, hey, that's actually something that, if we're not careful, that could happen to us. So always, it's sort of an ongoing process. And then at the end, we will be happy to get into some Q&A. But on that point, I would encourage you to enter your questions in real time as we go along. So, if we're on a slide and Kevin or I is talking about a specific point and it raises a question for you, go ahead and enter it into the chat at that time. And then we likely will hold all of that for the end. But look forward to answering any of those questions. So I will ask Kevin to say a few words about himself, and then we'll carry on from there.
Terrific. Thank you, Greg. It is, as I said before, it's a pleasure to be with you. A little bit about my background. 25 plus years in strategic communications, persuasion, also a long history as a crisis manager. I served in that role for a national organization that was made up of college students on campuses across the country, and I helped them to manage the number of crises that would occur, as you can imagine, among young college men. And then also have worked with law firms on litigation, and also worked with insurance agencies, and have known and grown to know through some board service I've done in the past about the art and the science of risk management, and have dealt with the media on a regular basis. And particularly what we're proud of at Kurth Lampe, we have a simple mission statement: it's ideas delivered. We help our clients figure out what to say, who to say it, and then make sure it gets delivered to that targeted audience, so we can help turn complicated ideas into easily understandable messages.
So as you can see from the video feeds, Kevin and I both have our winter beards here as we are battling the Chicago winter. But I've been privileged to work with Kevin and his wife, Kitty Kurth, who founded Kurth Lampe a number of years ago. And my background is not so dissimilar from all of you. I'm actually a Seventh-day Adventist, an Andrews University graduate, as undoubtedly some of you on the call are. But I have spent most of my career, I started my career at Hinsdale Hospital, actually, so I have some experience in the Adventist health system, but have spent the bulk of my career in public relations agency world. So for the most part, larger agencies, if you've heard of Edelman or Burson Marsteller, I spent about 11 years at Burson Marsteller heading their corporate reputation practice in the United States. And as part of that, as we talked about in our last session, and we'll talk about today and in future sessions, the very close linkage between reputation, brand, and sort of how to build that and tap that as an asset, also as a helpful buffer against possible damage from issues and crisis communication. So I've worked with large organizations, I've worked with small organizations. For example, I worked with AIG in 2008 when I was at Burson Marsteller, sort of as the great financial crisis was exploding. And you may recall AIG becoming the poster child for that financial crisis. So I spent a lot of time on site in New York with many other senior members of Burson Marsteller, helping them navigate through that crisis, which was a fantastic experience. But then in more recent years, as Dave intimated at the start of our webinar, Kevin and I have worked with a number of, possibly some of you, but certainly with a good cross-section of Adventist institutions, helping to manage some issues and try to help blunt possible crises. We actually did a lot of work with the North American Division in 2005 when, 2015, sorry, when Dr. Carson was running for president. So that was fascinating. And we, what's relevant, you know, to this conversation and upcoming conversations is looking at this issue, this challenge, and turning it into a positive, right? So we talked about how to, you know, our original charge was how do we correct misperceptions that will be out there in the media about Adventists and sort of maintain the appropriate distance for the Adventist Church from Dr. Carson's campaign. But at the same time, Kurth Lampe came in and we helped look for positive opportunities. So we had this window of great national media interest. And so it gave us a chance to tell some really compelling stories about the Adventist Church and who we are as a people and what we believe, that sort of thing. So it's really a pleasure to be here today to draw on some of that experience and to help you understand some of the steps that can help you effectively manage issues as you move forward.
And I'm going to take a personal point here, and just to those of you that may be involved with Adventist Health, my mom had a stroke last year and was treated at the Shawnee Mission, Kansas Adventist hospital there, and has fully recovered and very quickly, and was just you know, thrilled at the level of healthcare and, more importantly, the level of concern from the staff and the doctors and everybody there at Shawnee Mission. So I just wanted to kind of add that little personal note that you obviously, that Adventist Health is I'm grateful for them in my family. So it kept my mom around, which is always a good thing. But next week, there can't be any crisis. My schedule is already filled. And it reminds me of a client that we worked with in the past who had an issue that was continually attracting attention, and there was a public policy position, social policy position that they had, and this position had a tendency to attract activists, and what they did was they understood that this issue could attract this kind of attention. And so, because, as I like to say, issues attract activists, activists create crisis. And what happened was, because they understood that this issue could create some interest in the campus from activists, they became ready. And they were ready for something to happen. So when an activist group approached the school about coming and to basically doing a protest at the school, instead of the school saying, no, you know, you can't, you know, you're not welcome on our campus, you can't, you know, we don't want you anywhere near our campus, which all that would have created would have been a press conference and a protest outside the gates of the school, which would have attracted negative publicity. What the school did was it said, all right, we understand that you have a disagreement, and invited them on campus and had a private meeting between the activists, students, and the administration, and had a discussion about this issue. And because they acted in advance, they're able to take an issue and not let it be turned into a crisis, because they understood that the issue could cause a crisis down the road. And so they were able then to take this situation, be able to create a dialogue and create something that was helpful for the students, for the administration, but not bringing any undue or unfair publicity. It all starts with reputation. Reputation is the core. That is what you stand upon. What people think about you is how you're going to be perceived. And you have to go after your reputation and cultivate it. You have to go out and, as we talked in the previous seminar, create the things that create your reputation. Be able to do things that are active, do things that explain who you are. And reputation happens both from within and without. People within the organization need to understand what your reputation is, but also you need to understand what people from the outside think about it. And the stronger your reputation is, the less likely and less damage that's going to occur when something does happen. Think of the reputation as this bedrock that you stand upon. And the stronger that it is, when there are attacks, when there are crises, when an issue becomes a crisis, you're less likely in order to have something bad in your reputation to be destroyed.
Okay, so before we really dive into the content of today's session, we wanted to just sort of take a poll right here at the outset. So what is the difference between an issue and a crisis? Some people, well, before I won't elaborate too much. I want to get your actual thoughts, and then we will discuss further. But different words for the same type of situation. Neither one can be anticipated, both devastating to an organization. If you would kindly take the poll right now, we will talk a little bit about the results and then move forward from there. This is a topic, of course, that in my experience, really at agencies large and small, certainly we come across. We deal a lot with this in our current roles here with Kurth Lampe, but also, previously when I was with Burson Marsteller and with some other agencies, we talk about this a lot with clients. So 18% of you say different words for the same type of situation. 45% say neither one can be anticipated. And 36% of you say both devastating. Both of them are devastating to an organization. So this is sort of a great starting point, because part of our premise here today is that actually a lot of issues can be anticipated and planned for and prepared for. And we'll talk you through some key steps today on how to identify some of those possible issues and what you can do ahead so that you're not surprised when something that could have been anticipated happens. And then how do you sort of manage that proactively now and develop strategy and identify, the subject matter experts and who would be a spokesperson in a certain scenario, all of those things, so that having, done some homework to build a positive reputation and then proactively manage some issues, you can help reduce your risk and help reduce the damage to your reputation and brand going forward. So we will now talk a little bit about defining those issues. So how do you sort of start to see where some of the weak points are, where are some of the gaps, where might problems emerge from? So let's talk a little bit about kind of the definition of an issue. And there's multiple viewpoints on this, and we'll get into some of those here. But one way to think about it, and a lot of people think about it this way and sort of gear their issues management process in this spirit, is that an issue that goes unmanaged often results in a crisis. So that's, to my earlier point about what are these, various types of issues that can emerge. So if you have not anticipated some of those issues, if you have not prepared for some of those issues, it can morph into a crisis much more rapidly. Whereas if you have thought about this issue set in advance and planned for it and actually manage it, sort of the opposite side of the point being here. So if you have not done all of that, that's part of how you can get into a crisis situation.
I'm going to share with you 3 different stories that we have dealt with through our professional career that deal with this particular issue about an unmanaged issue. One, an insurance broker that we worked for. Insurance agencies have what is known as a premium trust account. And the premium trust account must be maintained, and it must be balanced on a regular basis. People within the organization knew that there was a challenge that the account was not being managed properly, and that this was an issue that was ongoing. And then what happened is when the employees warned management didn't take care of the situation. And then the employees left and became whistleblowers. And the employees, the former employees, went to the federal government and says their premium trust account is not in balance, which then created an incredible crisis situation because the agency, the brokerage, did not take care of this issue when it was being presented, and it spiraled out of control and eventually destroyed the brokerage. Another situation that we dealt with, a housing facility kept having deferred maintenance, and things that were supposed to be fixed did not get fixed, and the problems continued to manifest. And the board was not being conscious of their decision, their fiduciary responsibility to maintain that property in a safe way, and the issue just festered and festered. People talked about it but didn't do enough. There was band-aids and things that went along to do some maintenance, but not the kind of maintenance that needed to be done. And then tragically, that maintenance created such an unsafe position that there was a fire and injuries resulted from a result of the issue not being managed. Now, on another story, which is a little more positive outcome to it, the national organization that had been dealt with reckless behavior on behalf of its members had for years known that this was an issue. And finally, the management and the board stood up and said, you know what, we're not going to tolerate this type of behavior anymore. So this reckless behavior, this behavior that's inconsistent with the values of our organization, we're just not going to tolerate it anymore. And we're going to start suspending memberships. We're going to start managing the issue here and turning around the behavior so that the behavior was not reckless anymore and not endangering. And what has resulted is that organizations' lost history has dramatically dropped. Where they were the subject of a number of lawsuits at any given time, where there are currently no lawsuits in the last couple of years against the organization based on the behavior of its members. So when an issue is taken care of, when an issue is addressed, a positive outcome can happen that is good for the healthy organization, but also can protect the organization in the future.
So here's another way to think about what is an issue. So as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, there's really multiple ways to think about this, multiple perspectives, and it's sort of good to have a holistic thought process on all of this, because it can lead you to a more productive outcome. So, you know, one way to think about this is what are those topics that can reasonably be identified in advance and to some extent prepared for or managed. So again, in the coming slides, we'll talk a little bit more about how do you identify those topics and those issues, and you can identify them based on your own organization's experience, but not just that. You know, your peer organizations within the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but even more broadly within the faith-based context, the nonprofit context. So, you know, these things don't have to always sneak up on us. We can see what has happened in the past. We can learn from history, and that can help us prepare on these topics to help manage them, to get messaging in place, to get some materials in place before things actually happen. So yet another way, and this is sort of the last sort of global definition we'll talk about here, but think of issues management. You know, anticipatory is really a key word here. So preparing ahead, identifying what those issues are, and then bridging to a strategic management process that helps organizations detect. So you can see the early signs of an issue that's starting to bubble up, maybe on social media or maybe in some other context, and you'll be prepared to respond appropriately to trends or changes that you're seeing that could otherwise be problematic for the organization. So these trends that you're seeing, these changes that you're seeing, they could you'll have the knowledge at that point to understand that they could crystallize into an issue that could raise the attention and concern of important publics and stakeholders. And I would add here that even within the church context, we do have stakeholders, right? So we have members perhaps in the pews, we have conference and union leaders and division leaders that we need to manage. We have community leaders. So even though we may not be used to thinking in this vein, we do have stakeholders, and we need to understand the different ways that a possible issue could affect some of those relationships and affect perceptions in a way that's not productive for us. So here, we sort of get to the crux of it, right? The difference between an issue and a crisis. And it's, not to oversimplify it, but as we've been essentially saying, issues are slower build and largely can be anticipated. And that's a critically important point that we will hopefully help you today to think more about and understand how to identify those issues ahead of time. So, you'll have a much better chance of heading off an issue, of limiting the damage from a possible issue by preparing for it today, very soon, before that issue emerges, than you do when you're in the heat of the moment, which leads us to crisis. What's a crisis? Well, again, one definition of the crisis is unpredictable. Natural disaster, airplane accident. Crises are unpredictable. They pose a serious threat, and they require immediate response. So one of the points we sort of touched on earlier, or we'll get to later, is certainly issues management and crisis management are related, but it's not the exact same skill set. So it's helpful to understand what sort of tools and skills are needed in each type of situation.
While related, different approaches are needed. By paying attention to a crisis, by paying attention to issues, crises can be averted. Now, the words aren't interchangeable, but can be dependent upon each other. An issue is ongoing and can be addressed. A crisis is when an issue grows out of control. That's kind of the simplest way to look at the two. Key estimated figures here: approximately 70% of eventful crises could have been identified and planned for in advance. So if you identify issues and can deal with them, like we talked about earlier with the school that understood that one of its policy attracted activists, because they were prepared, they're able to do something about it. Because the student organization identified bad behavior and did something about it, they're able to avoid the crisis in the future. 80% of crises are caused internally, action or inaction of leadership or by other employees. So be cognizant and be understanding about what is going on.
All right, we are now going to take our second poll question. So what can be done in advance of an issue arising? So the options here are very little. How can you possibly know what is coming? Quite a lot. History is a great helper. Or option number 3, you can actually prevent any damage through thorough preparation. So I'll look forward to your answers here, and then we can chat a bit about that. This is really, as you know, this is really the crux of what we're here talking about today. Okay, do we have answers yet? Okay, all right. I'm pleased that the bulk of the responses are in the latter two buckets. So yeah, 60% agree that actually quite a lot can be done from an issues management perspective, to help anticipate, to learn from the past, mostly more so recent history, but it's always a good idea to look farther back as well and learn from the mistakes of the past. And The third point is not 100% accurate. You can't always prevent all damage with thorough preparation, but we would certainly make the case that you can mitigate that damage, that the damage will be less lasting if you have prepared thoroughly. In our last webinar on reputation building, we talked about this notion of reputation as kind of a goodwill bank. And the more you invest in that bank by doing, good things in the community service, by building relationships with the city council, by, actively networking and doing health fairs and, just doing the things to show your neighbors in the community that you really care about them, that sort of thing, you're building this goodwill bank so that when an issue inevitably does arise, and you've done your due diligence and prepared, you're that much better off as far as limiting the damage that can occur. So just to talk about the sort of mindset, we talked about sort of related but somewhat different skill sets. So issues management is very much a strategic, anticipatory, ongoing process. Again, it's about anticipating and identifying some of these issues in advance, but it's also about this, strategic and deliberate thought process about if issue X emerges, how is that likely to affect us? What is our position on that issue? How do we want to be seen responding to an issue like that? And then there's crisis management, which is rapid fire, in the moment, instinctive, but not just raw instinct, right? It's also about, going through training such as we're sharing now and getting more experience and greater perspective about what to do in a crisis situation, how to handle those issues that can crop up, and then just being strategic, but also, you're acting very rapidly in a crisis, whereas with the process of issues management, you have the benefit of being able to prepare in advance.
So how do you create a risk-reduced, crisis-resistant organization? So here's some of the principles of effective issues management, but I want to start this section by sharing another story with you. We counseled an international NGO on messaging and on strategy and how they were talking about some very difficult and timely issues around the world. We find out one day that one of the senior advisors is interested in visiting a conflict area in a country outside the United States. Unfortunately, the organization did not really take a look at how this issue could have become a problem for them. There wasn't any preparation. There wasn't any discussion. There wasn't any advice given. And all of a sudden, this advisor finds themselves in this country and then finds himself arrested for basically delivering the message of the organization. But if the organization had understood the risks, they might not had to have dealt with the crisis and not had let the visit happen. And then what happens is now when they're in crisis mode, they now have to spend their time and resources dealing with the arrest and imprisonment and getting this person out of jail than actually doing the good work of the organization. So because they didn't manage that issue, it created this larger crisis. So some of the principles of effective issue managers is anticipate, think ahead, what could possibly go wrong. Time is on your side, but only if you use it wisely. Be able to, take advantage of that time, but make sure you use it in a cost-effective way. And then be thoughtful and deliberate. It is important to really examine everything that could possibly go wrong and then deliberate and understand what could possibly happen.
So we look at three key dimensions on issues management. So as we, basically from this point for the next few minutes, we'll make it concrete and talk about some of the specific action steps that are coming up. And then we'll go through a series of slides on these topics. But identifying the issues and figuring out how you're going to analyze them effectively, how to make those strategic decisions, how do we prioritize issues, how do we respond to possible issues, and then there's an evaluation process. It's important not to just sort of give a quick hit response and then walk away, but really to keep an eye on a situation and evaluate the effectiveness of your response and possibly to recalibrate as needed. So Kevin sort of set up this section talking about crisis resistant organization. Let's be clear that there's certainly no such thing as crisis proof. So just understand that no matter how much we prepare, we're not going to be bulletproof. There can still be problems that will affect the organization. However, taking those proactive steps to identify and to manage those issues will absolutely and measurably help reduce risk to your organization and brand.
So there are the number of ways in which proactive issue management helps the organization. Know now before it's too late. Helps head off potential crisis by knowing now. Protect your reputation. Guard the value you put into your reputation, and always reduce risk. I like to say, less risk, less sleepless nights.
Yes, that's an excellent point, Kevin. So it's helpful to understand issues tend to have a life cycle. So it's good to understand sort of where you are in this life cycle at any given point. So there's the very early stage, which is kind of where we are now in terms of, just sort of thinking through what some of these issues are. But then when an issue actually does crop up, and assuming you've taken the steps to prepare, you'll be that much better prepared to identify the early stages of an issue. Then there's the emerging stage. So you're a couple of days into an issue. It may be already starting to evolve in different ways. There's current. So that's sort of where you are today. You've prepared for the issue. You've seen the first handful of evolutions of the issue. Now today, where you are at any given point in the life cycle. And then if you haven't been able to head it off, perhaps you haven't prepared, it has morphed into a crisis, and then you're sort of in that different mode of, the media is on the phone and constituents are calling, and how do we respond? And then once you have gotten through that, maybe the media has lost attention and moved on to the next thing, then you're sort of in the dormant phase. But by dormant phase, we don't mean, okay, it's done, it's over, it's gone with, let's move on. That's a good period to sort of reflect and understand the effectiveness of your response, to articulate your key learnings, and figure out what you can do even better in conjunction with managing future issues. So now we're going to touch on some key steps that you can take as you start to anticipate and prepare to manage some of those issues. So from a step-by-step standpoint, it's very important to understand, and I've touched on this previously, to scan the environment. So it's important to do some research and to talk to people within your organization who may have been there 20, 30 plus years and understand some of the more difficult problems that the organization has encountered. So this is part of the process of helping to anticipate what could come in the future because we've seen it before, right? That's part of how we can prepare for issues, is by recognizing, there aren't that many new things under the sun compared to what has happened in the past, not just our own organization, but by scanning the environment, we do that research and understand what has happened to peer organizations, to other nonprofits, understanding the types of things that can happen, period, and seeing what might be relevant and applicable to your own organization. So then we assess and analyze vulnerabilities and monitor, and we'll go into a little bit of additional detail here.
So when you're scanning the environment, find examples of like-minded organizations. Use them as people that you want to do this online research. Interview and talk to other people. Talk to your stakeholders. Talk to your colleagues. Ask them what keeps them up at night. Search out people in similar industries that can help you understand. Find colleagues from professional associations, or even mentors or mentorees that you've had through the course of your own career. You only want to move forward by basing what's happened on the past. Learn what has happened in the past, but don't forget the future. What can, for instance, advancing technology, what problems can that create in the future?
So a key step in issues management is identifying and addressing vulnerabilities, what we often refer to with clients as a vulnerabilities audit. So coming off of that research, coming off of the conversations that you're having with stakeholders and leaders within the organization about what keeps you up at night, what are some of the nightmare scenarios that you could envision that could affect our organization? So based on that research and given the nature and culture of the faith-based organization, then you start to think about which of these issues maybe are more far-fetched as opposed to which are more likely to occur to us. So, you could think about setting up various categories, a spreadsheet with various categories. So from a financial perspective, here are 3 or 4 things that could affect us that we really need to think about how to strategically respond to. Operational, how would we prepare for a natural disaster in the community? Say, we live along a major river that sometimes goes into flood stage. How do we prepare to respond for issues like that? It may not be a crisis because it's happened before. We know what can happen. We know what the after effects can be. So how can we get ahead of that through proper preparation and planning? And it's also partly recognizing you're not the expert on every single thing, right? So there are people within the organization, within the church, who have specific subject matter expertise. So know who to tap into to help you reach the right decisions as you prepare to address some of these issues.
So strategic decision making, prioritize the issues, put them in a list, give them an order. The likelihood is it going to affect, and list them from what's most likely to happen to least likely is going to happen to you.
And then once you've got this list and you've sort of gotten buy-in from leaders and your peers across the organization, think through, you've got this list of possible issues, you've sort of ranked them, whether it's, 1 through 10, or you tier them, those that are most likely and possibly could inflict the most damage are tier 1. And then you've got a tier 2 that would be just underneath that, so on and so forth. So once you've got all of that in place, figure out what your perspective and approach would be to each issue. Think through what we would call the decision tree factors that would help drive a response. If this happens, then we respond this way. And if that happens, we respond differently. And be always cognizant of sort of a range of scenarios from, maybe 3 scenarios, from best case to likely case to worst case, and be prepared to respond in any of those situations. And as I sort of alluded to on the last slide, know who your subject matter experts are. You'll need them in advance to help develop messages and draft responses, because again, the more you can do of this in advance, the much more effective you'll be by not having to do it sort of in the heat of the moment. And then earlier I touched on the fact that it's important to measure and possibly recalibrate, because as well intended and as thoughtful as our initial reaction and response can be, it's always possible that the way we intended for ourselves to be seen by the community is not the way the community actually respond. We might have been a little bit more insensitive than we expected, or have said something that was a little bit off key. And in our conversations with community leaders or with church members, we come to that realization, then let's recalibrate and figure out how to get closer to eliciting the desired response. So, it's important to set your goals. We often, I've often talked with clients in a range of industries that you have to set a clear objective at the outset of the emergence of an issue. Now, that objective rarely should be just make it go away, because that's honestly not the world we live in, right? It's gonna have a certain life cycle, sorry. And we need to understand what's a win in that sort of situation. So that can change depending on the nature of the issue. As we see a lot of things crop up on social media that we wouldn't have seen 20 years ago. And if there's a difficult discussion emerging on social media, the win would be different than perhaps if it's an issue where you're getting a lot of calls from media around town. If constituents are directly affected, then you're going to have a different set of goals. If it's church members, so on and so forth, relationships in the community that can be affected. So think through all of this. What is the objective, the hoped for outcome once you get through this issue? And then you manage your process and your strategy accordingly. So here, as we sort of near the end of our conversation at this point, and then hopefully you'll have some questions for us here in a couple of minutes. This is just one example of a way to start thinking through, once you have identified this issue set, you can sort of tier them under potential issues. And part of your tiering would be understanding what's the degree of likelihood, based on conversations within the organization, we think these 5 things are more likely than these next 7 things, but also think through what's the possible impact. Even if this one's more likely, maybe it's not as damaging as, something further down the list. So it's important to understand and balance the different elements that can go into issues management. So who are the subject matter experts? If something did happen that required a formal response, maybe it was an issue in the community, and while it hasn't, let's say, risen to the level of generating media interest, we know that the community leaders are really upset with us, and we really need somebody to sit down with them for a face-to-face. Who is that person going to be, and how do we prepare that person to deliver our messages effectively? What kind of materials are we going to need? So a lot of times, I work with clients to develop, messages in advance. What are the 3 messages that we really need people to understand about our organization, about what we believe about this particular issue, and how do we deliver that message, and through what vehicles and through what channels? Maybe it's frequently asked questions. Maybe there's a reactive holding statement that we need to prepare to the media, and then just sort of keeping track of what materials we already have developed. And then, you'll have a folder on your server, or multiple folders on your server, where you can organize and track information. But this is, just think of this as one possible example of how you could set up a spreadsheet. There's plenty of good tools that you can find online that may suit you better, but this sort of outlines a good way to start thinking about issues, identifying issues, and working through a process.
And then to point out that the SME is the subject matter expert. That would be the people that understand the most about this particular issue, and can be the people that are the resource that you immediately go to help explain something. So that is what an SME means, and I encourage everybody to do this exercise within the organization. And that brings us to an opportunity now to go to questions and to Q&A here. You can use the Q&A section of the Zoom if you have any questions. And David, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate the presentation today. This was very, very much in line with the risk management methodology of assessment and then understanding what are we going to do to mitigate the risks that we experience and control them and sometimes remove them entirely. We do have a question in now. How do you allocate time for anticipating and preventing crises that haven't occurred when the organization is already understaffed and overworked? I may have heard this question before. I'll turn that over to you, Kevin.
Oh my gosh. See, and actually what has been my experience, even in roles where I have been a volunteer board member in a large organization, if you're not taking the time to manage issues, they turn into crisis, and it is your responsibility. It is one of the core things that you do in any position in order to understand basically what could go wrong. And to take a look at the operations, and it should be an integral part of every bit of planning that you're doing within any organization. Whatever your position is, part of you needs to be thinking, what could possibly go wrong, or what are things that are happening that could be a problem down the road. It's one of these things where you're just going to make it a part of what you're doing, adding to that already overworked, understaffed situation. But for the health of the organization, if you don't address it and don't manage the issues, there may not be a organization to be overworked and understaffed at.
And I would just add, I think a common trap is for whomever within an organization is most responsible for communication, or sometimes it's an HR function, for that person to feel like that they are in it alone. And so I think it's important to view issues management as sort of a priority of the organization, of a function of the organization, and for whomever is sort of at the helm for that particular role, just to make sure to engage and involve others across the organization in tasks and developing, the content that's needed for effective issues management.
We do have, oh, sorry, go ahead, Kevin.
No, I was going to point out the good work that you're already doing here, and with the resources that are available on the AdventistRisk.org site.
Yes, for those on the call today, I think many of you may already be familiar with the resources we have on our website, but probably worth mentioning as well. AdventistRisk.org is the Adventist Risk Management website, and we do have a section called Safety Resources, which should be of particular interest to you. We have that organized sort of by, resources that are more specifically tuned for churches, another section for schools, camps, a few other categories. But as you're looking through those, they are then further subdivided because you have topics like child protection, which helps with preventing and dealing with the aftermath of child abuse, or those kinds of crises when that occurs. Also, dealing with emergency planning. A large number of topics. There's webinars, there's info sheets that you can print off and share with, if you're having a meeting, presentation, need to share something with your colleagues. Different types of resources that we've prepared, found, sourced, and we present them there. So please do make use of those resources on our website. And we always like to learn about, what's something that you're experiencing that we really need to dig into more. There's a few things we're working on this year to fill in some areas that need further development. And frankly, gentlemen, your work in these webinars and some other things we're working on together are really in that lane as well, to further develop the resources on crisis management. We do have a number of questions, though. I've been rattling on here. So oftentimes in a church setting, the members have a good sense of trending issues. How can leaders and pastors tap into the membership to get a handle as to what issues are percolating?
I'll jump in on that one. So I think, in my experience, I'm not a pastor, but I do attend an Adventist church, as I mentioned. And I'm friends with a lot of fellow church members on Facebook. That's a pretty easy way to get a sense of what's bubbling out there in terms of top of mind, or what might be unsettling at any given time to members. So certainly I would encourage church leadership to keep an eye on the chatter on social media. But beyond that, I mean, I think pastors probably cultivate relationships with all sectors of the church. If there happen to be sort of many cliques within the church, but really just making sure to proactively seek out the key influencers within a congregation to understand and really ask leading questions, to try to keep a finger on the pulse and to engage, really not just elders and deacons, but to engage lay folks in the life of the church. And I think with those types of conversations, I think a pastor will keep a finger on the pulse of what's happening.
Yeah. There's something to be said about having a healthy organization, and healthy organizations are able to speak to each other about difficult things that may not be they may not be fun, but
Right.
it's better to look at a problem square in the face and understand it honestly, including one's own abilities, lack of abilities, whatever those are, and be able to face them. And we have another question really along those same lines. Can you discuss how to build the type of candor that is needed to discuss issues with leadership? And I just listened to a podcast on my way to work this morning, and it was entitled "That's Not Good Enough," and it was really talking about the idea of having candid conversations and being able to address an issue and not saying that the person's not good enough, but the outcome or the work might not have been good enough. I ask you gentlemen to weigh in on how do you have and build that kind of candor in order to actually face a crisis rather than stick our head in the sand, so to speak.
It's interesting. One of the most important skills I learned was back as a peer counselor in high school, and I learned active listening. And I learned the ability to actually sit back and listen to what somebody else was saying, and to actively participate, and to be there and ask open-ended questions, and to make sure that your door is always open, both physically and metaphysically. It is important that you create an atmosphere that people can come to you and that they can talk with you without fear of retribution, without fear, but that you also are interested in them. And as you establish relationships with all of your team, make sure that people understand that the questions are important. I forgot, I usually talk about at the beginning of these seminars about how I like stupid questions. And I like questions that you're afraid to ask. And when we work with clients, one of the things we first say to them is like, if your question is whether or not you should ask us a question, the answer to that question is always yes. And so please always ask questions, and that helps to build that. And then if you're the person being questioned, the way to encourage more candor is to be able to answer and be able to listen to what they're saying and understand what they're saying.
Yeah, and build that culture that is open to good questions and bad questions. What I've discovered
Yes.
in a lot of meetings is someone will ask a really bad question, a dumb question, a stupid question. You know what? Usually, almost everyone else is wondering the same thing. It wasn't a bad question. It was something that wasn't clear to anyone, and everyone's a little relieved that someone had the courage.
Hey, glad we got that out of the way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will say that to coin a phrase or to create a cliche, stupid questions lead to smart solutions.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we have one question here, which may be very specific. I think they're thinking very much of a certain type of crisis. And gentlemen, I ask you, you can probably add to my thoughts here, but in a crisis, who are we to protect first, the organization or the victim? So there's some assumptions made here in the question. I'm just going to go ahead and um, work with those assumptions. And the assumption is that perhaps somebody has been abused. They're a victim in some sort of way. My response from an ethics, a legal, and a moral standpoint would be you should probably err on the side of protecting the interests of the victim. But that's not to say that we get ahead of the process too far. Move, get the right parties involved. If it's in, for example, in my illustration, a case of abuse, you want to report that to the authorities and allow them to engage in the investigation process. That's not something for you to engage in yourself. And then bring this unfortunate and terrible problem to the organization. Every once in a while, you encounter a person who fails us. Maybe you report this to your pastor and they don't want to share that with the person who needs to know. They don't want to tell the conference, or they don't want to report it to the authorities. It's your responsibility to bring it to the authorities. And if they don't want to tell the conference, you should definitely do that. And I may be using a completely different kind of illustration than what the person asking the question had in mind, but I hope that's helpful in an illustrative way. Gentlemen, do you have a perspective on that kind of scenario?
It is definitely a parallel track, with the victim slightly moving ahead of the organization. Because you're not looking to protect as much as you're looking to communicate and investigate and find out what's going on. And it's, as far as the organization is concerned, we do have a duty and responsibility to protect people whose lives are entrusted to us, or their livelihoods are entrusted to us. We do have a responsibility to them. And so we have to make sure that their needs are taken care of, and we're providing the right support services that they need, but also understanding at what point, when does law enforcement have a role, when does the attorneys have a role, and understanding that there's going to be a number of other players or other actors in this situation that we all have to work with. But immediate aid to the victim is right away, and then it follows right along about understanding what happens, and that in turn is what you're doing to protect the organization.
Well said. Well said. I think with that, we've come to time. I'm going to leave it to you, gentlemen, if you want to have any closing thoughts that will send us on our way and carry us over till we meet again for number 3 in our series.
Sure. So as you can see here on this last slide, Kevin and I are always happy to give a brief consultation. If something does occur and you're in your process, but you have some questions, you want to reach out, use this as a sounding board. You have our contact information here. But I think the key takeaway from today is that most issues can be anticipated. They can be planned for. And if they are planned for in advance, that the pain is likely to be much less intense and much less lingering if and when those issues do crop up. So we thank you for your time and for your participation today. And we hope to interact with you again on the upcoming webinars.
And we are in the process of writing a crisis manual. Somebody looked for books and resources on this. In fact, I will add in the crisis manual, as we're working through the draft process on this, some resources and some books that will be appropriate for persons to read. But we'll also have a crisis manual. And I think what David, we also have coming up in February, the opportunity to meet in person, right?
We do. So we're looking forward to shaking hands and breaking bread. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I really appreciate each one of you. You're out there doing the work of our organization, pursuing the mission of the church. So our thoughts, our prayers are with you, and we hope that our information is supportive to you in that work. So thank you, each one of you. And until next time, we'll see you soon.